Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, All In on Climate Resilience, Understanding and Adapting to Extreme Heat. My name is Laura Brush, and I'm a Senior Program Officer with the Climate Adaptation and Resilience team at World Wildlife Fund, and I'm really happy to be here with you all this afternoon. So first, some quick background on our programs for those not familiar. America is All In, also known as All In, is the most expansive coalition of leaders ever assembled in support of climate action in the United States by mobilizing thousands of US cities, states, tribal nations, businesses, schools, and faith and cultural institutions. All In champions a whole of society approach to drive climate action that science demands. And World Wildlife Fund serves as the lead organization and founding partner of All In. Beyond our work with the coalition, we collaborate with communities, companies, governments, and civil society organizations to build resilience for both people and nature. And I'll note that while many groups define climate resilience in different ways, WWF specifically defines it as the ability of systems to maintain functionality for people and nature by recovering from climate-related shocks, adapting to long-term changes in climate, and transforming when necessary. So with that context on our work, we're excited today to host this very timely conversation. And while communities around the country, as you all are well aware, are facing a number of climate-related hazards from flooding to more intense hurricanes like the recent hurricane in Houston and drought and wildfires, today we'll focus on extreme heat, including the current impacts of it as well as future risks, its threat to public health and well-being, especially for disadvantaged communities, and critically, adaptation strategies that can be used to build resilience. So quickly, just to set the stage for the issue, as you may be experiencing yourself directly this week, as we are in DC, extreme heat or heat waves, which are defined as persistent periods of unusually hot days, are occurring more often than they used to in the US. According to the EPA, the frequency of heat waves has increased steadily from an average of about 2 heat waves per year during the 1960s to about 6 per year during the 2010s and 2020s. Heat waves are also hotter than they used to be and are occurring for longer periods of time when they do happen. While hot days and heat waves are a natural part of day-to-day variation in weather, extreme heat is becoming more common due to climate change, and temperatures can be particularly high in cities because urban development typically removes tree cover and green spaces and increases the amount of paved surfaces in cities, which increases local temperatures. And this is a phenomenon known as the urban heat island effect. Um, and as extreme heat intensifies, it's having more and more impacts. It's the most deadly weather-related hazard, it can cause severe illness, particularly for older adults and disadvantaged populations. It can increase the risk of wildfires, can damage crops and endanger outdoor workers. And it can cause power outages as demands for air conditioning strain the power grid. But in the face of these impacts and risks, there's good news. We have resilient strategies that can decrease exposure and vulnerability to extreme heat and safeguard public health as well as local economies. These include strategies like increasing tree cover, installing cool roofs and pavements, developing emergency management plans, conducting awareness campaigns, among others. And to support communities in implementing these strategies, the federal government has actually significantly increased resources for extreme heat adaptation in the past couple of years, including through legislation like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. For example, the Biden administration recently announced that FEMA will award nearly $1 billion through its Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program to protect against the range of climate-related hazards, but including extreme heat. Last year, the administration also announced $1 billion in grants through its Urban and Community Forestry program to expand trees and green spaces in urban areas. The Department of Labor, just this week actually, issued the first ever federal heat safety standard to address excessive heat risks for workers. And the government has also enhanced its technical tools that can be used by local decision makers and communities themselves for planning for heat, centrally located on a new website called heat.gov. So we'll hear more from our speakers later on how communities are leveraging these resources for resilience. But to kick us off, I'm pleased to introduce Mayor Ron Nirenberg, who will give our opening remarks. He is the mayor of San Antonio, which has the 7th largest population in the US and is one of the nation's fastest growing cities. In an effort to combat the effects of climate change, Mayor Nirenberg spearheaded a climate action and adaptation plan, which was adopted by the city council in 2019. The mayor is also on the Climate Mayors Steering Committee, which is a group of 24 mayors who serve as the leading voice in efforts to further climate action in the more than 400 cities across the US that make up the Climate Mayors Coalition. So thank you, Mayor, for being here, and I'll pass it to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers and the panelists for putting this together, this webinar on extreme heat. Obviously, it's very timely for us all over the country, especially as the heat wave continues to roil the western United States with record-breaking temperatures 15 to 30 degrees above average. I will share with you, I was just in Nevada, and the heat there was downright dangerous, even in the morning light. In San Antonio, we too have faced consecutive record-breaking temperatures, with 2023 being the hottest summer on record, where we reached a total of 75 days where temperatures reached at least 100 degrees. The previous record was only 59 days. So we obliterated that record, and it looks like we are not stopping there, unfortunately. Extreme heat affects everyone, but it disproportionately impacts specific populations in San Antonio: low-income communities, communities of color, the urban core, people dependent on our public transportation system, and people living in aging housing stock. These are the folks that bear the brunt of extreme heat, and San Antonio, I know, is not unique. Heat in San Antonio, though, is not distributed equally, and there are severe inequities in our built environment. Communities of color are often subjected to more extreme heat due to less tree canopy coverage, less permeable cover, more concreted areas, and older housing stock, much in need of critical repairs and improvements. Unfortunately, many residents who deal with oppressive heat also are unable to turn on their window units during the day to avoid high energy bills, so they are bearing the brunt of the costs of this crisis. Alleviating these impacts requires a comprehensive set of mitigation and adaptation strategies that are detailed in the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan that was adopted here in San Antonio in 2019, built on a concept to bridge inequity and therefore rooted in climate justice. We've taken an all-hands-on-deck approach by implementing a host of short, medium, and long-range solutions meant to mitigate the impact of extreme heat on our communities. First, we've focused on investing in our families most in need, living in our aging housing stock. San Antonio is a 300-year-old city, and therefore many of our residents are in housing that simply has fallen into a state of disrepair. Through an affordable housing bond in 2022, the city's first ever, we allocated $45 million exclusively for home repair. And since 2022, we've preserved over 1,000 homes with necessary repairs and upgrades. I'll add that through that home repair program, we're also preparing homes that needed those repairs for additional weatherization through other programs that are available in our city and through our energy utility. Next, we've worked to leverage every available funding opportunity through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, to historic investments in the future, particularly with regard to infrastructure and climate resilience. This includes leveraging the direct pay provision to approve a $30 million project to install solar canopies on rooftop solar on 42 city facilities over the next 3 years, collectively producing 12.7 megawatts of power, one of the largest municipal installations in the country for solar. And through the EPA's Solar for All grant, we will be extending solar accessibility to low-income and energy-burdened households. Finally, CPS Energy, which is our municipally owned energy utility and the largest municipally owned energy utility in the country, has leveraged funding through the BIL and GRIP to invest in innovative projects such as microgrids and solar-powered batteries to reinforce the resiliency of our grid. We've taken an aggressive approach to improving capacity, but also making sure that that new capacity is low or no emission generation capacity. These investments are on top of our recent decision to shift our energy utility away from coal-powered generation by 2028, 3 decades ahead of schedule. Very proud of that. We are in a climate emergency, and the time to act is now. I'm proud of the support we've received through the federal government, through the BIL and the IRA, and these investments will continue to help support San Antonio and incorporate cleaner sources of energy that will benefit our most vulnerable communities. So again, thank you very much for organizing this critically important panel, and thank you for inviting me here today.
Thanks so much for that, Mayor. And I guess one additional question for you. You mentioned some of the federal resources that your city is harnessing to do this work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the additional support, whether that be resources or information or technical assistance that you see as a need for the city to continue to do the work and expand on it, whether that be from the federal government or public-private partnerships. Anything you can comment on that?
Sure, it's really all of the above, Laura. From a technical assistance standpoint, it actually starts within the city because our mantra has been to leverage everything. I mentioned we have a lot going on in home repair. So we want to dovetail those home repair opportunities that are primarily for lower income communities to opportunities to support energy resiliency within the home, which is a big source of the housing cost burden, and also will help reduce energy demand on our overall grid. I will tell you that the BIL and the IRA have been critically important for us. We make use of the direct pay provisions. I've mentioned some of the innovative work we're doing with CPS Energy. That's done through pilot projects and things that the IRA allows us to do that are more of an R&D nature to help us advance the energy resiliency portfolio of our city. So we're taking an all of the above approach to looking for opportunities to leverage funds. But you know, where we need additional traction, I would say is within the private sector. I don't think we can overlook the importance of private sector in advancing our energy transition. We've worked with them closely on policy solutions. We also need them to be investing in their own infrastructure in a way that corresponds to our overall climate goals. I'm happy, though, that the president and this administration has led. These are historic investments. They're available to every community. And I'm sure my counterparts have visited quite frequently with the EPA. They are not just a policy-making body anymore. They are a funder, and we should all be working with them to make sure that those funds are distributed in a way that moves all these goals forward.
Great. Thank you so much for your thoughts and for being here today. We really appreciate it. And I think we will now turn to our esteemed panelists and our presentations first. So first we'll hear from Shweta Arya, who is a senior project manager for the American Public Health Association. Shweta currently works on the city's First Smart Services project and creates cross-disciplinary partnerships to encourage cities to address and prepare for the health risks associated with extreme heat and excessive rain, and to reduce health disparities by implementing smart services as a health solution. Shweta, I'll turn it to you. You're muted, Shweta.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. All right. Although I was working on my slides, they're still not. Can you see my slide now?
Yep, we can see them.
Hey. All right. Just a second. All right. Okay, and now I need to just go back. Sorry about that. All right, so can you see my slides okay and hear me okay?
Yep, all good.
All right, thank you so much, Laura. I'm really appreciative of this opportunity to be with you all today. My name is Shweta Arya. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Project Manager, Smart Surfaces at American Public Health Association. With extreme heat breaking all records, I think this is a really opportune time to talk about extreme heat. As Mayor Ron said, 2023 was the hottest year in recorded history, and 2024 is looking no better. As we speak, millions of Americans are under extreme heat threat. We are feeling it when we step outside. I live in Philadelphia area. We step outside and we really feel it. In Las Vegas, I read that it hit 120 degrees, which is an all-time high. How do you even function in that kind of temperature? 5 straight days of 100-degree temperature in Portland. What is most worrying is the cascading impacts of extreme heat. This last headline I just added like last night, and it really blown me away that millions of people lost power in the midst of a heat event. I mean, that can really lead to mass casualties. And that is what's really worrying. Extreme heat is threatening our critical infrastructure that our modern life is so dependent on, whether it's transportation, our healthcare system, our food system. Extreme heat is the #1 weather-related cause of death in the US. It kills more people than hurricanes, flood, tornadoes, all put together. But when we look at the research, public perception around extreme heat is still very low. There's a huge mismatch in perception and reality, and that's why I think we need to do more around education, and that's why we need to do more of these webinars and really work on educating our communities around the risks associated with heat. So let's talk about the health impacts of extreme heat. Humans are warm-bodied animals. We live in a Goldilocks zone, a really narrow range of temperature where our bodies can really function well. If our body is heated above 105 degrees, our organs will stop functioning. And if we are cold and we go below 95 degrees, we can die of hypothermia. So we are really in this really small, narrow zone to really survive or effectively function. Humans cool itself through sweating, but when it's really high, humid temperatures, sweating doesn't really help much. We can't evaporate our sweat. And it's really, it makes our heart, our kidney, our lungs really work harder. And it can cause dehydration, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, worsens the chronic conditions, and also impact our mental health. But everyone is at risk of extreme heat, but some of these groups are more vulnerable to heat: pregnant women, newborn, children, elderly, people already experiencing chronic illness, and other groups like young athletes who are playing outside, our unhoused population, outdoor workers who are more exposed to extreme heat temperatures. In our rapidly warming world, cities face even greater burden than rural areas, like Mayor Ron just described, right? 80% of our population resides in urban areas in the US. And over centuries, cities have really replaced green and porous surfaces, and we've really been building. So if you think of any big metropolitan city, whether it's Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, we see these concrete jungles, and they are absorbing heat, and they can be 10 to 20 degrees hotter than our suburban and rural areas. And low-income populations that are residing here have lesser trees and lesser green spaces. So they're really have to deal with other issues like higher energy burden, and they have to make decisions between heating their homes or putting food on the table. And that's why I think extreme heat cannot be addressed without equity. Legacy of racist policies and historic level of disinvestment have really made low-income communities a lot more vulnerable. And the community is more hotter and less livable. And that's why let's talk about solutions. And Laura, I'm still doing good on time. I just want to make sure I'm not.
Thank you. Yep.
Okay. So recognizing this reality, APHA joined hands with Smart Services Coalition. In fact, APHA was the founding member of Smart Services Coalition. And the goal of the coalition, the coalition did about 40 leading national and international organizations with a shared commitment to create cooler, healthier, and resilient cities so that they can deal with impacts like extreme heat and flooding. So currently, we're working on this multi-year project with 10 cities around the country and help them transform their built environment by adopting some of the smart services technologies like cool roofs, cool pavements, green roofs. And the funded partners, these are the funded partners that are working on this with us on this project. And how we work with the cities is, these are some of the buckets that we work with them on, providing the data and creating the cost-benefit analysis so that they can make that informed decisions of which policies to adopt. We help with the community engagement part, advice on federal funding like IRA, provide policy and legal advice through our partners, and health research and communications. So what are smart services? Smart services offer passive cooling technologies that are more sustainable because we cannot get out of this by just utilizing air conditioning. We need those passive cooling technologies that can cool our neighborhoods without utilizing air conditioning, which really puts us back in that feedback loop. So smart services are cool roofs. Cool roofs are utilized all over the world, to reduce temperatures. Folks can save up to 30 to 40% on their energy bills by utilizing that. And others that are here. And then utilizing them in combination is what we are going for, because we've seen cities utilizing one or the other, but how can they really deploy a combination of these services is the key. What we are most excited about is the benefit cost analysis tool, which can really give choices for the cities to make the best decision possible. And this is just a quick visual around how we can transform these concrete jungles into more livable, breathable spaces where communities can thrive. And these are some of the benefits of utilizing smart services that can help reduce temperatures, produce cost savings, reduce energy bill for residents, deliver reductions in flooding, improve public health and air quality, protect summer tourism, and create jobs, all while focusing on the lower income communities and communities of color, really addressing these inequities in those areas. And lastly, what is the APHA affiliates role? So APHA has state affiliates in these cities who are leading the public health, who are becoming the public health voice for the project, really advancing these climate solutions as health solutions, working to create awareness around health risks associated with extreme heat and flooding, and supporting equitable climate policies to accelerate the adoption of smart services. And that is all for me. You can go on our website to learn more about smart services, and also on the website of smartservices.org, and I'll put that in the chat. And I will give it back to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Shweta. That was really interesting. I will now pass it to Annie Carfaro, the Climate Justice Campaigns Manager at We Act for Environmental Justice. Annie is responsible for engaging We Act members and residents of Northern Manhattan in the organization's climate policy initiatives and overseeing policies and programs that promote equitable land use in the community. Thanks for being here, Annie.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really grateful to be here. I am going to talk a little bit about our organization, We Act for Environmental Justice, which is actually a member of the Smart Surface Coalition, and some of the local work we're doing in New York City, and in specific, our neighborhood of Northern Manhattan. So just a little bit for those that might not know, We Act for Environmental Justice. We're a 35-year-old community-based organization that was founded in West Harlem in an effort to fight back against environmental racism in New York City. So this ugly-looking building here on the slide is actually a very foundational part of We Act's founding story. This is the North River Sewage Treatment Plant, which was originally slated to be built in the Upper West Side, which is a much affluent, much whiter neighborhood where residents had complained, and it was quickly moved up to Northern Manhattan, which was historically a community of color, lower income, more working class. This was a neighborhood that already had a marine transfer station. It was inundated with bus depots. It was inundated with highway on-ramps, and the air quality was already significantly worse than Lower Manhattan. When they opened the sewage treatment plant, it was constructed with open sewage tanks, which created an unbearable stench. It created really bad air quality. Residents were experiencing respiratory issues. They were having to keep their windows closed even during the summertime. And we also found that some of the facilities on the sewage treatment plant were not up to code, which led to a small group of activists, including We Act's founder and executive director, Peggy Shepard, to fight back against the city. And they sued the city in the 80s, which was unheard of a community-based kind of volunteer group to go up against New York City and win, but that's exactly what they did. And the settlement that they received from that lawsuit not only went to fixing the sewage treatment plant, which now exists in the neighborhood today, but has a beautiful park on top of it and is now more of a community treasure than it is a toxic site. It also allowed We Act to hire its first full-time staff. And so since then, we've grown to advocate for our local community as well as frontline communities across the city and state and now country with a national policy team. So we're here to talk about extreme heat. This has been something that's been on We Act's radar for a very long time. We, back in 2017, started our Heat Health and Equity Initiative, which was meant to educate our community about the impacts of extreme heat. Like Shweta said, extreme heat has often, while being incredibly dangerous, kind of gone under the radar as a climate emergency. And we've done research and advocacy that led to a couple of publications that you'll see here. In 2022, we started working on an extreme heat policy agenda, which we update every year with the policy recommendations that we're pursuing to address extreme heat. And I'll talk a little bit about those at the end. We also, this year, we're one of the co-founders of the New York State Extreme Heat Coalition, which is the first statewide heat coalition focused on urban areas across the state and environmental justice communities. So Shweta mentioned this, and I want to kind of talk about it again in a local context. Extreme heat impacts are not felt equally across the city, and much of that is due to systemic racism in our policies, in our politics, and our decision making for decades. So we're all familiar with redlining, or I hope many of us have heard of redlining before, but this was a coordinated disinvestment in neighborhoods that were home to minority populations back in the 1930s. And it prevented many residents who were people of color from obtaining government-backed loans that led to their neighborhoods to go into decline while white suburbs and whiter neighborhoods really prospered. So the legacy of redlining extends far beyond housing segregation. Its impact can be seen today in people's access to healthcare, educational opportunities, and their exposure to climate risks. Many of these areas are, flood vulnerable, and they are much hotter than neighborhoods that were not redlined. So fast forward to today's time, New York City has what's called the Heat Vulnerability Index, which is the map that you can see on the left. And this shows neighborhoods whose residents are more at risk for dying during and immediately following an extreme heat event. And you can see, if you're looking at these two maps, there's an uncanny similarity between the neighborhoods that were formerly redlined and those that have the highest heat vulnerability risk. And We Act, if geographically you're not familiar with New York City, We Act works in northern Manhattan, which is at the top end of Manhattan, and you can see Central Harlem, East Harlem, and much of the Bronx have some of the highest heat vulnerability in the city. And all of these areas were also formerly redlined neighborhoods. So what does that look like on the ground? You can see here, the heat vulnerability index takes into consideration the built environment. So as Shweta was talking about, surface temperatures in cities can get really, really hot. But certain neighborhoods are more equipped to handle these increasing temperatures. So on the left, you see a street in East Harlem, which is a neighborhood that We Act works in, that is a formerly redlined neighborhood. You see very little street trees, all concrete, very little shade access, compared to a neighborhood block on the Upper West Side, where you can see, older trees that are actually providing shade, shrubbery, etc. We've done heat tours through East Harlem with a surface temperature monitor, and have found that on any given day, a block in East Harlem can be 31 degrees hotter than a block on the Upper West Side. The impacts of redlining have also impacts on housing quality. So in New York City, many of the neighborhoods that were formerly redlined are some of the homes with the highest maintenance defects. And so that has very significant impacts when we're talking about extreme heat, because these homes are leaky, they're poorly weatherized, they're much harder to cool, and they're much more expensive to cool. So the map on the right, you can see that energy bills in some of these neighborhoods that have more maintenance deficiencies actually are paying more money every year for their energy costs, despite having lower incomes. And so we see this often in our communities and talking to our members. Many people maybe have an air conditioner, but don't run it because the energy bill at the end of the month is going to be something that they can't afford. And so they're either sitting in a sweltering apartment or are forced to flee their apartment during really hot days like today or like the past 2 weeks to go and find, publicly available air conditioning in a cooling center. And so all of this has very negative impacts and inequitable impacts. And in New York City, Black New Yorkers die of heat-related illnesses at disproportionately high rates. They make up 50% of heat-related deaths, despite being only 25% of our population. And this is, again, a part of the systemic racism that has been baked into our decision-making and our policies for decades, now playing out in the climate crisis in frontline communities. And lack of access to home air conditioning is a really important risk factor for heat stress death. Among those who die from heat stress in New York City, the most common place of death is an unair conditioned home. So about nearly 60% of heat-related deaths in homes occur in homes without air conditioners. In New York City, about 90% of residents have access to an air conditioner, but among low-income populations, that drops to 76%. But then the more insidious fact is that of the remaining 42% of heat-related deaths in home happen in homes where the AC is either not working or not in use. And so this is a major point of advocacy for We Act. We know that there are long-term solutions, but in the immediate, we need to make sure that people have access to air conditioning. Air conditioning has been treated as a luxury. It is no longer a luxury. It is something that can keep you alive during a heat wave. But the cost of using an air conditioner is not taken into consideration by many of our existing policies, which leaves people who are low income, who can't afford, again, to run their air conditioner in a reliable way to keep their body temperature down and to keep themselves safe ends up putting them at risk. So I just want to end by sharing, and we might go into a little bit more of this during the Q&A, some of the key pieces of advocacy WE ACT is working on related to extreme heat. And I focused really on the city and the state level. That's where a lot of our work lives. We are pursuing an indoor maximum temperature. So this would be legislation that would finally assert cooling as a right and not a luxury. In New York City, our building code has a minimum temperature threshold in the winter. So landlords must ensure that tenants have access to heating, and they must maintain a temperature of at least 62 degrees inside of apartments once the temperature outside falls below 55 degrees. So we're looking to explore how can New York City put these standards in for cooling protections, especially now that New York is considered a humid subtropical climate. We're also looking at expanding and improving cooling centers. One of the first reports that we did was a cooling center audit back in 2021, where we looked at the effectiveness and the use rate of cooling centers across the city, and found that while these are a vital resource that, a vital tool that we need to deploy in our extreme heat advocacy and response, to make sure that everybody can have access to cooling, publicly available air conditioning during heat waves. There's a lot of room for improvement to make these cooling centers more accessible, better utilized, and more informed, making sure that staff at these cooling centers understand heat-related illness, et cetera. And then at New York State, we're looking at expanding our state's LIHEAP allocation to put more money towards cooling assistance. LIHEAP has historically been a vital energy affordability bill in the wintertime. Increasingly, states are using LIHEAP allocations to help address cooling costs in the summertime. Unfortunately, in New York, our cooling assistance program can provide eligible New Yorkers with an air conditioning unit, and that's where the support ends. And so we again run into that problem where somebody might have the air conditioner, but they're not running it because of the utility costs. And so we have been advocating for many years to have the LIHEAP cooling assistance program also support utility bill costs as it does in the wintertime in the summertime. And then last but not least, we've been advocating for a bill called the New York Heat Act. This would do a number of things, but most importantly, it would limit energy costs for the New Yorkers who have experienced the most energy burden by putting a cap on energy costs at 6% of household income. This would mean that any household that is paying over 6% of their monthly bill towards utility bills would have their costs reduced. And so this is again addressing the people who are putting a disproportionate amount of their monthly paycheck towards their energy bills to help them, stay safe again, both in the wintertime, but now increasingly in the summertime. So thank you so much. This QR code will take you to our extreme heat policy agenda, where you can read a little bit more about these policies, and we'll also send it out after this webinar, but really happy to be here and happy to answer any questions as we get to the Q&A.
Thanks, Annie, so much for that local perspective. So we've heard from Texas, now New York. So we'll turn to California. I'll introduce Andrea Yagoyan, the Chief Innovation Officer for 10 Strands. She leads a California-wide whole systems approach to integrating environmental and climate action into the campus and curriculum, community, and culture of K through 12 schools. Thanks, Andrea.
Great. Well, thanks. It's really great to be here, and I really appreciate the opening remarks from the mayor and also from the learning from the panelists. Thank you all so much. I'm here just to share a little bit of a perspective of how K-12 schools can and should be a part of climate resilience, in particular for this issue of heat. And I'll just share really quickly, I work for an organization called 10 Strands, and our mission is to strengthen environmental literacy and sustainable and climate resilient schools in California. And for me, I've been at all different scales of education as a classroom teacher, a site level director of sustainability, a county coordinator, and now doing this work from outside the system. And most folks probably don't have the context of the California system, but it's really big. And I'm sharing this here just so that people can understand the scale of trying to address climate impacts in a state that's as large as California, but really in any state, it's complex. And it might make a little more sense to see that complexity with this type of map and understanding that when we deal with climate impacts, right, we're dealing with all these folks along the coast who are dealing with things like sea level rise and extreme precipitation, and also the folks in the valley dealing more with the high heat issues. And the thing that makes it really complex for schools is that they are their own jurisdiction. And so when climate impacts happen, they don't have the resources of cities and counties necessarily. They have to partner with cities and counties in order to deal with this the climate crisis that they're experiencing. So I'll share a little bit about my journey into resilience as a person who works in schools, and hopefully build this case for understanding like why we need to pay attention to schools for climate impacts, in particular high heat. When I was a site level director of sustainability in Oakland, we dealt with high heat, and we didn't have air conditioners because the climate has not really needed air conditioners. And so something that we had to figure out is like, well, how could we shade the school buildings in order to provide more access to shade and cool the buildings down? And we were able to do that doing something and having energy resilience. But we also dealt with wildfire smoke. We also dealt with drought. And then we also dealt with the whiplash of extreme storms as well. And so for us, it was about kind of grappling with all this and just trying to figure out like, what can we do just at this one little school site? So that was sort of my entry point into dealing with climate crises. When I went to San Mateo County Office of Education, which was the first Office of Education in the state to have an environmental literacy and sustainability coordinator, it was right around the time that the IPC was writing many of these really key reports that let us know, like, no, climate change is here, this is really intense. And I remember thinking, well, they hired me to do environmental literacy, not necessarily climate impacts and adaptation. And so I had to do a lot to try to help my school system understand why I thought it was also really important to be talking about that. And I mean, this is like not a good thing, but also a good thing because it kind of helped because climate change became really real during that time. We had so many wildfires in California. We experienced so much high heat. We were in the midst of a large drought. Sea level rise was happening across many communities, in particular where I was working. And we also had some extreme precipitation. So that narrative, people started to understand, oh, these disruptions are really real, and it's really hard for schools to handle it. Luckily for me, I was in a county in San Mateo County that was really looking to address this. So every city in the county had a climate action plan, and they were working on an initiative called Climate Ready San Mateo County. Even still, they were at the beginning of this process of thinking about like, how do we do this at a county level, city level? And then how do we bring other partners in, like school jurisdictions that are embedded across these cities and counties? So I learned a lot about resilience and why it matters and how to bring schools along into it. And from that, we were able to be a part of a local hazard and mitigation plan, which helped us really think about all of the county buildings, but the county Office of Ed buildings, but also the 23 school districts that we were serving. And from that, we made a climate impacts guide for the schools in San Mateo County so that they could start to think about all these climate impacts. So I'm going to focus now in on heat just to give a little bit about that. And I'll also share that now that I work at the statewide level, we're doing a number of different initiatives that help really think about these climate impacts. In particular, the Climate Ready Schools Coalition is really looking to advocate for more state dollars to help manage climate impacts. We're working on a partnership to support educational leaders to understand what these climate impacts are. And then a couple other initiatives, the California Schoolyard Forest System that I'll mention later, and the California Environmental Literacy Initiative. All of these different networks are starting to say, like, we need to focus, yes, on environmental literacy and sustainability, but also climate mitigation and adaptation. So when it comes to high heat, like thinking about all of those different things, when it comes to high heat, what I know, because I had the privilege of working with Dr. Kelly Turner on a high heat virtual policy forum that we did in California on December 23rd, we learned a lot from her and the work that they were doing at UCLA about how how schools are really being impacted by high heat. And I knew it myself from being a teacher and being a site level director of sustainability and being in schools, but this gave us the perspective of how is this happening across California. So one of the challenges we face is that indoor temperatures in schools are not currently, there's no upper limit. We don't have a limit on that. And so there's no required air conditioning or cooling system situation for California schools. And I know that's true for a lot of other states as well. Another huge challenge is that high heat really contributes significantly to learning loss in schools. And this is true for many other states, that this problem is disproportionately impacting students of color and students in low-income communities who often have the least access to air conditioning and cooling centers. Children are the most vulnerable to the impacts of heat. And for us in California, there's currently no statewide database to track which schools do and do not have air conditioning. So it's hard to know which students are the most vulnerable to that situation. So that's a real call to action for data across California on this. And I know that and a lot of other states need that as well. Some solutions when it comes to buildings and thinking about that is thinking about cooling equipment, passive cooling, and other building retrofits. And right now is a really good time for schools to be thinking about this in California and across the country, because you can leverage some IRA funding for making these improvements to schools and really helping to mitigate the impacts of high heat. And I encourage folks to check that out with our partner Undaunted K-12. They have a lot of amazing resources about how to leverage those funds. It's also an issue though when their kids are outside, right? When they're outside for recess, when they're outside for lunch and breakfast and after school. So high heat in school grounds is really, really, really dangerous. And that's true for, in particular, that's true for asphalt areas, but it's also really, really true for rubber mats, and even the climbing structures in the playground. So they can be truly dangerous on hot days. But there are solutions. So one really key solution that we recommend to folks is just shade, having shade. And of course, because I'm partnered on the California schoolyard forest system, we are hoping folks will use shade from natural ecosystem, but there's other ways to do it with sun sails, and even like other kind of building structures can provide shade. So shade is absolutely critical for school grounds. And you can see from our partners at Green Schoolyards America, they're showing this before and after of what it could look like when you put some green schoolyard elements into a school ground. Not only is it just more fun and appealing for students, but you can see all these different elements of shade that's everywhere, really helping to protect kids and make that a safe space to play. So I'll elevate just that in California, and this is now actually going across the country with our partner, Green Schoolyards America. We're looking to have this initiative to increase tree canopy on public school grounds, in particular, to directly provide shade for students to deal with the extreme heat issues. So if you want to learn more about high heat, there's so many resources in schools in particular. There's a lot of resources. Check out that December 2023 virtual policy forum that we did. And then there's another upcoming Extreme Heat in Schools webinar from our partners at the Center for Green Schools on August 28th. So that might be a great way to do it. And then I'll just end by just sharing there are tips that you can do to work with schools. I highly recommend making this a part of emergency planning. That's a great entry point for helping people understand, oh, this is emergency scale. There's a lot of local technical assistance partners that people can work with. And then if you're looking to do high heat work or even any climate resilience work with schools, just know that you'll probably need to bridge a vocabulary gap. Most educators are not familiar with the terms climate mitigation, climate adaptation, climate resilience. So it's important to really meet them where they're at and help bring them into that conversation. I also highly recommend using data. In the slides that were shared from my presentation, there's quite a few data projects going on in California to help understand these issues and how to really serve the most vulnerable and most vulnerable communities first. And then just the last thing I'll share is that it's possible, change is possible in schools. It will take time to get buy-in and do assessing and planning, but it's really possible. And I highly encourage folks to work with schools for this issue of high heat in particular, and I'll skip over that one, but in particular, because schools can be a major leverage point for change towards community resilience, and they can be community resilient centers. So I encourage folks to work with schools as you look at this high heat issue to protect our most vulnerable populations, but also to provide this great asset of community resilience. So that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Really appreciate your perspective on working with schools. I now want to bring back all of our panelists for just a few minutes of discussion and Q&A. And our live audience should feel free to ask any questions in the chat. And if we have time, we can ask them. So to start off, Shweta, could you talk a little bit more? You mentioned your Smart Services Coalition and work. Could you talk about the barriers that you see cities experiencing in implementing, the range of smart surface solutions that you talked about, and how can these be overcome?
Yeah, thank you for that great question. I think, smart surfaces although have existed for a long time, but if you are really looking to use them in combination, sometimes decision makers don't have that knowledge or expertise, or they don't have enough research. So I think pilot projects like the Cities for Smart Services that we are doing are essential in giving them the data that they need. So what we are also hoping that the 10 cities that we are doing these pilot projects in, they can inspire their metro areas, cities, smaller cities, to really look at what processes they did, how they collected that information. And then the key for decision making here, what we are showcasing, is the benefit cost analysis tool. And the hope for Smart Services Coalition is to really put it out in public, so more cities can really utilize that tool to make the informed decision. Another barrier that we see is of course, financial constraint, right? So we're hoping that more and more cities and communities can utilize IRA funding. So they just released $2 billion in community change grants, and a lot of our community partners and cities are utilizing those kind of fundings for implementing some of the smart service technologies. So I think it's a really great opportunity to utilize those dollars in implementing some of these solutions. Another hurdle that we see is some of the existing policies and regulations are big hurdles in implementing smart services, but it can be moved around. That's where advocacy comes in, that's where education comes in to really move out of that. And lastly, I feel like the community resistance can be there. If we don't educate or we don't involve the communities from the very beginning, it's really hard. Sometimes they're not aware of those. You can't go in a new community and start painting the roofs wider, start painting the put reflective pavements there. But I think it's really important to educating the community and really involving them from the beginning of the process.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. And I think Annie might have more to say on that topic, but I have a question for her from the audience. Is WE ACT also trying to address climate mitigation regarding cooling, such as funding heat pumps, community solar, or other efficient cooling options, in addition to the weatherization and cooling assistance cost, and any collaboration with building owners since they have more leverage over tenants?
Yeah, absolutely. That's like a whole other bucket of work, building decarbonization, healthy homes, that is happening parallel to our extreme heat work, and is very much a part of our extreme heat work. I think the access to cooling is an immediate response that is going to help people now and keep people safe in the immediate future. And that is going to be coupled with the need that we need to, tighten our building envelopes, make sure that people's homes are free of environmental hazards, make sure that their appliances are energy efficient, and that ideally they're also not using fossil fuels. And so that's, an active body of work that's happening, like I said, alongside, and something that we're really excited about with heat pumps, that provides clean heating in the winter. They also provide cooling. And so we're looking through our maximum indoor temperature legislation. How do we make sure, or how do we incentivize landlords that may be required from this legislation to now provide a window AC unit, which uses up a ton of energy and is not really efficient? How can we incentivize them to instead switch to something like a heat pump, which is much more efficient? It also provides clean heat in the winter time and the summer. We do work very closely with building owners, WEACT is a clean energy hub, a regional energy hub in New York State. So we're working with homeowners and building owners in Northern Manhattan to try and connect them to some of the state programs that can help do some of this building level work. But we're also really hyper-focused on tenants, which make up the majority of our membership and who are often left out of this conversation and have the most to gain from some of these building benefits, but also can be put then in financial positions where they, many buildings in New York are master metered, meaning the landlord is paying heat and hot water. And if you switch over to a heat pump, now you're responsible for all your utility costs year round. And that can be a huge financial burden. And so there's a lot of pieces at play, but it's definitely a part of the solution.
Yeah, thanks for drawing some of those connections between climate adaptation and mitigation, because so often the solutions for one can also have benefits for the other. I guess one question that I think Andrew will have something to say, but open it up to all of you. Could you speak a little bit to how cross-sector partnerships really fit in here? What types of groups may not be working closely together or talking to each other, collaborating for action on extreme heat that could be to more comprehensively address solutions or implement solutions at the scale that we need to see to build resilience?
Yeah, I know this is not true for all places, but in California in particular, because schools are their own jurisdiction, like they have to bridge that gap between their system and then working with the city that they live in, then working with the county that they live in. So creating spaces where all these different stakeholders can come together to talk about real challenges like this, I think is really important. And organizing things like that at the county level can be really effective because it's at that local level dealing with the local challenges. So that's something that we saw be successful in San Mateo County. And I know because we're now leading some webinars on that taking place in other counties like in San Diego and a few others, that can be really effective. And then in that, bringing in other community-based partners, other agencies that can really support thinking through these issues, I think is super, super critical.
Shweta, any thoughts there, being from the public health?
Yeah, just wanted to just want to add that, oftentimes, like, of course, like I feel like extreme heat is a multifaceted issue, and it needs that kind of solution where we need diverse stakeholders to come together. But oftentimes we see that public health officials, the public health departments are not taken into consideration when they are planning urban design. If they are from the very beginning are involved in the decision making, they can really inform public policy in terms of protecting human health. They can guide the policies in terms of how can we protect the vulnerable population, tracking vulnerable population, tracking the health outcomes, and really design the policies that can protect human health. So sometimes they are really left out or not really intertwined in decision making, which is really key in producing some really great public health outcomes.
Great. And I guess one final question, since we're almost at the top of the hour here, and we'll end on a positive note. For each of you, what gives you hope or excites you about working on extreme heat adaptation and the opportunities in this space?
I can share. I think for me, the hope that I feel is coming from knowing that all these different folks right now are trying to work on this, in particular in schools. And then also I'll just share, seeing schoolyard transformation gives me so much hope. Seeing kids go from having to be trapped inside to going out and playing underneath these trees in these beautiful schoolyards because they've been transformed, is such a hopeful experience. And so that brings me hope and keeps me motivated to keep on going during this challenging time.
I can say a very similar answer, not to cop out, but I think just the fact that multiple parties and peoples and levels of government and advocates are talking about extreme heat now in a much different way than they were back in 2017 when we really started this work. And even just talking to residents, the knowledge sharing that happens between people, but then the advocacy spaces I think have grown so much, and that type of momentum is really encouraging because I think people are starting to feel the urgency, literally feel it, but that is how we initiate change. So that is something that's really exciting for us to see.
Yeah, I think just when you're working in the climate field, it can be a downer. You hear all kind of negative news around you. So I think it's very inspiring to work on solutions, inspiring to work on innovative solutions like smart services technologies, right? And I feel that they have a potential for transformative change in the communities that can benefit both people and our planet. So and another thing is to really bring diverse partners together. I think that really brings me a lot of joy to really see public health officials, departments really integrated in this approach of solutions, and really climate solutions being projected as health solutions. And lastly, just growing recognition of that health of our planet is inextricably connected to human health. So I think it's really, it's really great. We need to keep working together, and love listening to the work here folks are doing in their different respective organizations. And yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We have so many more questions, but we're out of time. So thank you again for sharing your perspectives and joining today. It's really valuable for us to hear. And thank you, of course, to everyone who listened. We'll be sharing with you the resources presented today and posting the webinar recording. If you want to stay connected with America is All In, you can sign up for our newsletters at americaisallin.com. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.